Just before.
Except for my colleague is not on record.
Sorry, yes.
This pleases the court, my lord. It's Advocate Mohammed Amuji, appearing on the instruction of the State Attorney, Johannesburg.
Amuji is M-A-M-O-J-E.
Exactly, my lord.
Thank you.
Initials M.
Initials M, yes. For the state, for the police.
Indeed so, my lord.
Thank you. Yes, before we commence, I need to place on record that yesterday, the 21st of January 2020, the court proceedings were held at the John Vorster Square Police Station, where an inspection in loco was done. Certain pointings were made out by some of the witnesses who had not yet given evidence. The full record of that inspection in loco will be reduced into writing and be read into the court record as soon as it is ready once the parties have concurred about the contents of what we observed at the police station. Thank you. We may proceed now to today's hearing.
And Lord, before we proceed, I was wondering if the court wishes to inform the public as to the new proposed sitting times.
Yes. Thank you. It has been agreed between councils and myself that we will henceforth from tomorrow commence proceedings at 9:30 in the morning, and on Fridays we will only sit up to lunchtime to enable some of the councils to go back to their chambers to prepare other work. So for the duration of this hearing, we will commence at 9:30 in this court until, and on Fridays we will only sit for half a day. Thank you.
As the court pleases. Lord, just a few housekeeping matters before we call our first witness for today, with Mrs. Jill Berger. I did promise the court that we would make submissions on the question of the missing documents in the first inquest record. With the court's indulgence, we would like to postpone those submissions because we're still trying to ascertain the contents of missing transcripts, around 400 pages, which witnesses testified, or which witness testimonies are reflected on those pages. And we also wish to ascertain more precisely the contents of the missing folder B2. We do have some leads, my lord, and we are following those up, and we will keep the court posted in that regard.
Thank you. And as regards when we were at the inspection in loco yesterday, there were certain, I think we couldn't get access to some of the portions of the building. The station commander informed us that he did not have the keys. Are there any arrangement being made as to whether there is another visit to the police station once access has been found how to get through to those premises?
Yes, that's correct, my lord. There are certain doors and gates which were locked and they didn't have keys for. The brigadier, who's the station commander, mentioned in our presence that he would have to bring in a locksmith in order to perhaps break open those locks and replace them. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Ms. Singh, would you perhaps be liaising with the brigadier in that regard?
My lord, perhaps a suggestion to his lordship is that we can ask for Brigadier Perumal to be here so that they can make the necessary arrangements and inform the provincial office in the interim that this is what the court proposes to do. The problem that we did encounter on the previous occasion is that when we ask for permission to John Vorster Square, we are told that we need to go via province, and it does take some time. However, I'm certain that the brigadier can be here so that we can inform him that in the event this needs to be done, they can make the necessary arrangements in the interim.
But I thought that yesterday that is what he said he was going to do.
Yes, my lord, but we can just inform him so that they can inform their officers. Otherwise, my lord, we can undertake to inform him.
Maybe I will get to be of assistance to find that, well, they need. I do not need him to be here. He just needs to tell the attorneys
I don't see the necessity for the brigadier to attend to court. My lord, I will liaise my attorney to inform the brigadier that the court request that those certain gates and doors be opened, and once open, we be informed so that we can inform the court that another inspection in the local be arranged if necessary.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I will bring that suggestion forward and with the request of the court forward.
Thank you. You may proceed now.
We're indebted to the court for reminding us of that aspect because, as we mentioned yesterday, we are anxious to demonstrate that there is at least one additional access point to those second floor cells without the necessity of going through the front reception office. My Lord, before I proceed, I would like to recognise the presence of some special guests in the court today. Mr. Sidney Mufamadi, former Minister of Safety and Security, who in fact himself was detained in John Vorster Square in the late 1970s, and he was also a comrade of the late Neil Aggett in the trade union movement. And secondly, my Lord, I'd like to recognise the presence of Mr. Mohammed Timol, the brother of the late Ahmed Timol, and together with Imtiaz Kaji and other members of the Timol family, campaigned for justice in that case.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Dr. Mufamadi. I believe not Dr. Mufamadi, if I'm not wrong.
Dr. Mufamadi, indeed.
Welcome. Welcome, Mr. Timo. You may proceed.
As the court pleases. My Lord, I'd like to hand up the affidavit of George Bezos, SC. My Lord, we had intended to call Mr. George Bezos, who led the legal team in the first inquest. Unfortunately, we have been advised that at present Mr. Bezos is not well. We are monitoring his condition, and if it improves, we will consult with him and see whether he's in a position to come and testify. But if not, we're lucky enough to have taken an affidavit from him some time back, and indeed this affidavit was signed on the 16th of October 2018. And my Lord, he simply deals with his experiences as a lawyer in South Africa in the 1960s, 70s and 80s during apartheid, and the struggles that he and his colleagues had in pursuing justice. And he focuses in particular on security laws and detention, the tragic pattern of deaths in security branch detention. He focuses specifically on the case of Neill Aggett and gives us his perspectives. And he also looks at the practice of inquests during the apartheid era. So, my Lord, I can commend the affidavit to you. It has been handed to all our colleagues, and from time to time, and perhaps an argument, we may make a reference to it.
Yes.
My Lord, we thought it would be helpful to hand up with the affidavit the chapter in his book, No One to Blame, dealing with the Aggett case. I'm just checking to see that it looks like I have been handed up the wrong chapter, so we'll do this at a later time. This is from another one. Lord, at the same time, we'd like to hand up the affidavit of Elizabeth Jill Berger.
Yes.
Lord, perhaps we can mark the affidavit of George Bezos, SC. I understand that our exhibits will be under the heading G, so this would be G1.
G1.
We could mark the affidavit of Elizabeth Jill Berger as G2.
Yes, thank you. please.
My Lord, with the court's leave, I'd like to call to the stand Elizabeth Jill Berger.
In which language will you testify in?
English, please.
Please state your full name and surname for the record.
Elizabeth Jill Berger.
Do you have any objection in taking the prescribed oath?
No,
Do you swear that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
You have been sworn in. Would you like a chair?
You may be seated if you feel comfortable. You may be seated if you want.
My Lord, I'm absolutely fine standing. Thank you very much for that. I just can't see you. That's the only trouble. Too many files. Thank you.
I don't know when you're looking to read all this.
Well, my Lord, it looks very impressive.
You may proceed.
Thank you, my Lord. Mrs. Berger, as the sister of the late Neil Aggett and the chief representative of the family, I know I speak on behalf of the court and my colleagues when I say this. This has not been an easy time for you and your family. And so we certainly understand that that you may need to take your time in your testimony this morning, and we will endeavour to give you as much latitude as possible. We're certainly grateful to you for making the time to be here for this inquest. I understand that you are based in the United Kingdom and you have to travel out here to attend the inquest, so thank you very much indeed. Before I start leading you with some questions, do you have any opening remarks that you would like to share with us?
I do. I would like to thank the state, and particularly the NPA, for reopening this inquest. My brother's death has left an open wound which has never fully closed, and I would like to have closure. And that closure can only come from finding the truth, my Lord. Why did the security police pursue my brother so relentlessly? And secondly, I want the truth of how he died. Thank you.
Thank you. My Lord, I should also recognise the presence of one other family member who will be with us, I believe, through most of the inquest, and that is Stephen Aggett, the nephew of the late Neill Aggett, brother of the late Michael Aggett.
Thank you.
Just to give you a sense of how we're going to proceed today, Mrs. Berger, I thought we could deal with your views of the early life of your brother, Neil. We could then look at his life as an activist and a trade unionist, and then deal with his period in detention, and then lastly what transpired as you experienced it in the post-detention period. We don't have to stick to that strictly, and from time to time His Lordship may also have some questions for you. So let's then begin with the young Neill Aggett, the Neill Aggett who you grew up with. Could you describe to us your brother as a youngster?
Neil was my younger brother by about 5 years, and I'm sure a lot of the women here have younger brothers, and one has an extremely strong tie to a younger brother. It's almost like a child, a son. One wants to protect them and love them. We grew up on a farm in Kenya, a fairly carefree and happy life. My parents emigrated to South Africa. All our lives we'd been at boarding school. We were, in a sense, quite hardened to some sort of emotional deprivation, having been to boarding school from such a young age, with not much contact between one term and the next with our parents. He was always a very generous, kind, soft-hearted boy. When we went to school in Grahamstown, again, far away from our parents, he used to visit me from school because he was allowed out of the boys' school. I wasn't allowed out of the girls' school. And every Sunday, we'd have a little time together sitting on the rugs on the lawn in my school and chatting and just being together, which was very important to me. I felt very bewildered about being in a new country, in a new school. So it was very, very important to me. When he got older at Kingswood College in Grahamstown, I think it was understood and evident that Neil had a great deal of compassion. He was made head boy of the junior school. And bit by bit, just recently, I've had little stories filtered through to me about how he treated these young boys. Someone told me yesterday how he had heard a story how one of these boys didn't know how to tie up his shoelaces, so Neil taught him to tie up his shoelaces. Another of the boys told me how he was allowed to keep food in his study, and he used to, when the children were hungry, he used to feed them this food. He was a very loving son and brother. And this sort of school period was probably when I knew him best, in fact. As with all siblings, as we grew up and went our separate ways, I perhaps wasn't as close to him as I had been. I left to go abroad to work, as so many people do, aged 21. And I left him, and I left my car with him so he could use my car while I was away. And we left on the very best of terms. He was a very clever boy. He got a very good first-class matric, got into medical school without any trouble, and read very deeply. And I remember even now how he wrote poetry when he was at school, how he read poetry, read philosophy, read about other religions, investigated other religions, always inquiring and searching for the truth. And that's young Neil.
Thank you, Mrs. Berger. At that young age, did Neil ever discuss and share his aspirations in the future in terms perhaps of what he would like to achieve in life?
His first ambition was to become a doctor. He was, my older brother was also a doctor, and he'd qualified 7 years before Neil did. And at school, they were known as Big Doc and Little Doc always. So if you ever speak to one of Neil's fellow pupils at the school, they'll remember him as Little Doc. And I wasn't aware of him having any political affiliations while he was still at school, though I'm sure he had started investigating political aspirations. Certainly philosophical and religious beliefs he was anxious to discover and learn, certainly.
And at any point did he share his political views or outlook with you and the family?
He did with me, but after he left school. I remember in particular one occasion when I was living with my husband in Pretoria, and he went on a hitchhiking trip just with a rucksack on his back all around Namibia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and the sort of northern part of South Africa. And he came and stayed with us for a few days. And I think that's when I understood a bit about what Neil's beliefs and understanding of what was going on in South Africa had grown very, very deeply in that time. Though you will hear from other witnesses, I'm sure, that this wasn't the first time that his political views had begun to form. But as siblings, as I say, siblings do, I was, working, we were all working and leading our own lives. He was living in Cape Town, I was living in Pretoria, so we didn't see each other very often.
But at some point you got to hear of his activities, perhaps political activities one might describe them, or activities aimed at pursuing social justice. Perhaps you can describe when you got to hear of his involvement in pursuing workers' rights and assisting the trade union movement.
Certainly. After he'd qualified and he'd worked in various hospitals, I saw much more of him when he came to work at Tembisa Hospital, because I was living in Pretoria, and I saw him regularly then. At that stage I realised that he was much more interested not only in treating people who needed help, but also in improving their lives. And I think he felt by just treating their medical problems, there was much deeper need for the whole system to change. And that's when I came, and as I say, I saw a lot more of him then. And that's when I realised his views had changed dramatically, and he told me how he had now joined the union and was working there. This was after he'd left Tembisa. And he was working at Baragwanath part-time on the weekends to earn what little money he needed to live. A little story, if I can just tell you, about when he was working at Tembisa and I was living in Pretoria. A friend of mine, Barbara Tanton, her name was, came to me one day and she said, my domestic worker has been very, very ill. She's been in Tembisa. She said there's an extraordinary man there, one of the doctors, who's unbelievably kind, generous with his time, so amazing. So I said, well, it's funny, my brother works at Tembisa. She said, what's his name? I said, Neil Aggett. That is the doctor. So right there, when he was working as a professional doctor, his empathy and compassion was very, very evident. He was extraordinarily busy, because I think he spent a lot of time talking to the workers, particularly when they were off shift. So time spent with his family was pretty precious time that he was taking away from his duties. My mother came to visit me in Pretoria, and he spent the weekend with us, which I am forever grateful. It was a delightful weekend. He played with my children. He was just very normal, my lovely, loving brother. And that is the last picture I took of him, which is in the book Death of an Idealist. And you'll see my two small children. It's a dreadful picture because I'm a terrible photographer, but it is the last picture I have of Neil visiting us with my mother on that occasion.
Thank you. That's the book Death of an Idealist by Beverly Naidu.
That's correct.
Mrs. Berger, can I ask you what the reaction of yourself and your family to the political involvement of Neil with the trade union and other organisations?
I can only say my reaction was very different to my family's, particularly my father. I would say my father was very right-wing. He'd left Kenya because he didn't want to live under a black government, and he'd come to South Africa. And I can honestly say he was not happy about Neil's decision. My mother loved Neil for what he was, what he believed in. There was no question about her loyalty to him, and certainly my loyalty as well. My husband and I, we just welcomed him with open arms as a member of our family. But my father was not happy about this, and he felt that he'd thrown away a promising medical career in order to pursue this particular course. But that's our situation. He and my father did not get on very well during this period of his life, from the sort of by the time second or third year of university through, well, I could say to perhaps just months before his death, when the atmosphere seemed warmer. They had communicated. Neil continued to communicate with my mother and with me, obviously. And I did receive phone calls from him, but I understood that he was extremely busy.
Thank you. Were you and your family concerned that because of his political activities, he may be at risk? And did you perhaps ever discuss the possibility that he may be arrested?
Do you know, I don't think I ever did feel that he was at risk. perhaps that was very naive of me, but I never did think he was at risk. He he spoke of his work. He had to explain why he saw so little of us, and he described the work he was doing. I was filled with pride. It was just amazing work he was doing. And to me, I never thought that he might be in danger, because I knew he was far too sensible to put himself in danger, which would pull him out of the whole job he was doing, which he was so passionate and dedicated to. And I couldn't imagine him doing anything illegal which would stop him doing what he believed was vital work.
And perhaps we can now turn to the arrest. How did you find out that your brother had been arrested?
Very early one morning I had a phone call from an ex-neighbour of mine where we had lived previously, to say that a policeman had knocked on her door at about 5:30 in the morning looking for me. Oh, this is after he's arrested. I do apologise. I've spoken at the wrong time and date time. I had a phone call from Neil one day when I was in Pretoria to say that he had been arrested. I was immensely shocked. I never thought it would come to this. My heart just landed up in my feet. I felt shocked and appalled. He was very calm. He said, "Don't you worry. I've done nothing wrong. There's nothing that they can pin on me. I'm just here for a questioning and interrogation, but all's well, Jill. Don't worry. Please let Mum and Dad know where I am." And that's, of course, what I did. I immediately phoned my mum and dad. They, too, were horrified and shocked. And even my father, at this stage, pulled all the stops out. What can we do? What can we do? I couldn't think of anything we could do. And it was only a couple of days later when I realised that there was an organisation called the Detainees Parents Support Committee, because a number of people had been arrested at the same time, and I joined that group. And that's when I learnt what detention meant, how long it meant. There was no habeas corpus like there is in the UK, where there was no necessary allowance for anyone to visit or see him. It was very, very frightening and very, very scary. That's all I can say. It changed my life. That moment when I knew he was in detention, and I joined the Parents Support Committee because they understood what this detention meant. I had no idea. I was very naive.
Just to confirm, the phone call that took place on the 27th of November 1981, and were you at home at the time when the call came through?
I was at home, yes.
So where was he calling from?
He was calling, I imagine, from a police station. I don't know where.
Sorry, next question.
Do you recall anything else that he mentioned to you, or is that the sum of what he had spoken about?
I think that is the sum that I can remember, his reassurance that all was well.
And so during that conversation, if you are able to describe what you thought his sort of state of mind and well-being was?
Perfectly normal, mainly reassuring me and anxious that I should tell my mum and dad what had happened. That's all I can recall, really.
And while we're on the subject of phone calls, during the course of his detention, do you recall any other phone calls, and if so, how many?
I never received any calls from Neil during that period. None at all.
So subsequently you became aware that he was initially detained in Pretoria and then subsequently moved on to John Vorster Square?
I only learnt that when I came to visit Neil on the 31st of December 1982. he then recounted where he had been held. And I realised that he had been held in Pretoria for a period, yes.
Just to confirm the date, that was 31st December 1981.
So, beg your pardon. No, it was
81.
1981.
Was it 1981? Yes, I beg your pardon. He died in 1982. I beg your pardon.
You made reference to the fact that you paid a visit to Neil. Can you describe to the court what was the process involved in arranging such a visit?
Would you mind if I just gave you some other information before
Yes.
I started that? With this committee of concerned parents, spouses, children who formed the detainees' parents support committee, we arranged a meeting with the head of the police. I can't remember his name, I should remember it. And we went as a delegation to visit this gentleman. And I can see him now standing at the end of a board table, and we all sat around. Some of my colleagues who were with me said that they'd had very serious reports of maltreatment of their children and their spouses. What could he tell us about it? He said they are being given the perfect treatment, there's nothing happening. I can assure you there is nothing. We're going to allow you to have visitors. They are being treated as privileged prisoners. His name was Kutsia. Sorry, I've just remembered his name now. And he reassured us that they were perfectly well looked after and they would never harm any of those people. I came away obviously suspicious that this wasn't the case, but we'd been told. And at this point, the detainees' parent support committee started pushing for visits. We wanted to see our children and our families who were detained. And finally, a call came through from, I believe, the detainees' parent support committee to say that Neil had been allowed a visit on New Year's Eve for the family. I was in Cape Town with my parents at the stage, so my mother and I travelled up by train. And at about midday, we called at John Vorster Square. We were taken into a downstairs area. We were both very traumatized at the stage, so I can't remember much, but I understand that the legal team have given me where we were taken on the 9th floor and by whom. I couldn't possibly recall that now myself. And we were taken to an office where Neil was sitting with an officer, police officer. We sat opposite him, the policeman very, very close, touching knees, in fact, and Neil opposite. He looked very pale, quite thin. He had quite bad eczema in his eyebrows and eyelashes, which hadn't been treated. He had no shoelaces, no belt. He was very quiet. We were warned several times never to discuss the case. And at one point when Neil said, "Don't worry, it'll only take a month or two and then I'll be out," the policeman immediately interjected and said, "You're not to talk about the case." And that was it. So we held his hands. He asked about Liz Floyd, his partner. Was she all right? Was she still detained? Very, very anxious about her well-being. We could give very little information. And the visit seemed over very, very quickly. At this stage, I can't tell you how long we were there, but it seemed to be over very quickly. We left with very, very, very heavy hearts. And as we left the building, we were in the same lift as a number of security policemen who were off to their New Year's Eve party. Very happy, laughing, joking with each other. It was a most terrible contrast. Yeah, that's my last time I saw Neil.
Thank you, Mrs. Bergman. Just to refresh your memory and for the court's benefit, the individual who monitored the visit was a warrant officer, Danvey Mapope.
Dan who?
It's D-A-N-V-E-Y.
D-E-Y.
D-A-N-V-E-Y. Surname Mapope, M-A-P-H-O-P-H-E. And it took place in office 9111 on the 9th floor of John Vorster Square. Just to confirm, Mrs. Berger, who accompanied you on that visit?
My mother.
Just the two of you?
Just the two of her. Joy Aggett, my mother.
The room in which the visit took place, was it just a normal office on the floor?
It was a normal office, yes. Neil and my mum and I were sitting in chairs, and the policeman on a table with his knees sort of in between us.
So where was Neil seated?
He was seated opposite me, my lord,
On a chair.
on a chair. Policeman here on a table, my mum and I here, so we could hold his hands. But the officer was very close. Well, you know, as I say, brushing knees.
Yes.
You've mentioned that he had no belt on and no shoelaces. Did you know why he didn't have those items on?
Yes, I understood why, but it just brought it home to me that he was in prison. I'd never been into a prison in my life. But I knew that prisoners had their effects that they could harm themselves with were taken away, always. And it just alerted me to the fact that Neil was in this horrendous place.
Do you recall how he was dressed that day? What he was wearing?
He was wearing casual clothes, as he usually wore, and I wasn't aware of anything unusual or different to what he normally wore. He wasn't in any sort of uniform, or he was wearing... It didn't sort of strike me as being different to what he normally wore.
So the warrant officer present, did he give any particular instructions and intervene at any point?
I do remember that one intervention when Neil said that he'd be out fairly soon. That was the only time. There may have been other interventions. That's the only one I can recall.
And did Neil ask any questions or make any requests during the visit to yourself and your mum?
I don't recall if he did. He may have said that he was hoping to study while he was under arrest, because he was very anxious to continuing his medical career and advancing it, I believe.
And according to your affidavit, he actually requested certain books on emergency surgery.
I can't recall, my lord, whether it was at that visit or whether the message had come down through the Detainee Parents Support Committee, but certainly there was a request to buy a very large book about emergency surgery. And my parents were in the process of getting hold of this book, because we didn't have Amazon in those days, so, you know, trailing a book and finding it to purchase it was a little bit more difficult than it is today. But they were certainly looking to buy that book for him.
And if you could just indicate to the court why you thought he wanted that book on emergency surgery.
Because he had said during the visit we had, that he was very keen to study and that he wanted to advance his medical studies. I think we assumed, he didn't tell us, but we assumed it would be surgery because the work he was doing at Baragwanath at that time was largely in the operating theatre.
And during the course of your discussion with Neil, did he give an indication or perhaps an estimate as to how long he thought he would be remaining in detention?
I believe he said 2 to 3 months.
And was there a reaction from Warrant Officer Mapope at that moment?
Yes, there was.
And what was his reaction?
You are not to talk about the case.
Did you and your mum ever feel threatened by a Warrant Officer Mapope?
No, we didn't feel threatened by him, but we felt that any incident on our behalf would only make Neil's life worse, so we certainly obeyed and we did what we were told. We didn't want this privilege taken away from us too soon. We felt very much we'd been given the privilege. We were made to feel we were being given a privilege to visit him, and we didn't want to undermine it in any way at all, because they wouldn't take it out on us. They'd only take it out on him at the end of the day.
And perhaps just to wrap up the evidence on the visit, do you recall how the visit ended?
With tears and hugs on our part, and he being as affectionate as ever and constantly reassuring us that he'd be fine. He'd be fine. I'll be fine, Mum. I'll be fine, Jill. And in a sense we believed him. He hadn't had a sort of closeted upbringing by any means. He'd lived in Cape Town in a worker's cottage on a wine farm without any heating or water. He toughed it out. He was a strong man, and his reassurance led a little assuring for ourselves. But that building was very formidable, and we left with extremely heavy hearts.
Was there any talk or discussion about the possibility of further visits?
No.
And indeed that was the only visit you were able to arrange?
That is correct, yes.
Sorry, that was the only visit.
The only visit, yes.
And it is 11 a.m. and I was wondering if we should give the witness a short break. Perhaps it is an appropriate time for the tea agenda.
Yeah. So 11, now break at 11:15, but that's fine. You can break now. Come back at 11:15 or 30 minutes.
Mrs. Berger, how much time would you like to rest? 15 minutes or?
I don't need much time. I'll be all right. Thank you.
I think 11:15 should be.
Very well done.
Thank you, my lord.
All rise.
Jill, you don't have to wait till you come right after. By the way, Jill, you're doing really well.
Sure, das geht.
and he arrived about a half hour later. My immediate thought on being told that a policeman was looking for me was that Neil was to be released, and it was a warning for me to go into Johannesburg to collect him. We'd recently refurbished a little outdoor cottage we had, where I was hoping Neil would come and live while he got his life together again, having been detained for about 3 or 4 months. I was quite excited, actually.
Mrs. Berger, just to confirm, this was at your home?
This is my home in Irene, Pretoria. Yeah. Okay. So I opened the door with a degree of anticipation. There was a policeman at the door, and he said, "Can I come inside?" I said, "Oh yes, come in." He said, "Can you tell your family all to come and sit down here?" Which we, my husband and myself. And he said, "I've got some very bad news for you. Your brother Neill Aggett has died." I can't tell you what a terrible thing that is to hear. Unbearable. And I immediately said, "You killed him. You killed him." He said, "Madam, it's not me." You know. And all he said was that your brother has been found hanging in his cell at John Vorster Square. And it's my duty to come and tell you that. And whereupon he left.
Did he specifically mention the word suicide and that the circumstances around the death?
I can't recall that. But I just think he said, "Your brother has been found hanging in his cell."
And I know this is difficult to relive, Mrs. Berger, but how did you react to that news?
Well, my initial thing was to say to this man, "You killed him. You killed him." And then he left. And, gosh, it's a very, very shocking thing, because I knew that it was up to me to let my parents know, my mum and dad, let his friends know, with this great, great ache. I hadn't been particularly well during this period of his detention, as I couldn't sleep. I had terrible nightmares. It had affected me quite badly during his detention. And then I had to pick up the phone and tell my mum and dad that Neil had died. Not easy. I then phoned David Dyson, who'd been a friend of Neil's.
Before we move over to the attorney, Mrs. Berger, can you give an indication, if you can recall, the reaction to the news of your parents as well as your brother Michael?
It's very difficult to say. It was on the phone. But they just sort of gulped and put the phone down, I seem to remember. I don't really remember at all. It was such a horrible thing to have to do. And Michael, who was living in Israel at the time, he was working in a missionary hospital in Palestine, in Nazareth in Palestine. And I didn't have any means to communicate with him, and I do believe they didn't even have a phone in there where they were living, he and his family. But my parents were, I didn't hear from them for a while. My mother phoned later on in the day to say that they'd made a booking to travel up to Johannesburg from Cape Town. And my husband and I met them at the airport. My father couldn't stand up straight, and he couldn't stop weeping. He was a broken man.
You mentioned that you approached the attorneys, Mr. David Dyson.
Not as an attorney, as a friend. I knew David had given me his contact details so that I could contact him at any time regarding Neil's detention as a friend. And I then phoned Mr. and Mrs. Coleman, whose son Keith was also in detention with Neil. They had been particularly kind to me and had helped me through this period when I was so lost and didn't really know how to help. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to speak to them initially, but they soon learned the dreadful news.
And how was it that you eventually arranged legal representation for yourself and the family?
David was incredibly helpful. He said he would speak to. He was at the time was working for a firm of attorneys, Beldew and Hall, and he said he would take care of the legalities of this, and that I must, as soon as possible, come to his offices in Johannesburg, which I did later in the morning with my husband. We left the children with some friends and travelled to Johannesburg. And I felt as though my whole middle of my person had just disappeared. I can't tell you that awful feeling. I'm sure some of you experienced it.
According to your statement, the family then had to identify the body for identification purposes. Can you explain how that happened?
When we got to the offices of Beldew and Hall, Mr. Lane, who was a partner in the firm, spoke to me, and David. They met me and my husband. And one of the first things we had to do was to identify Neil's body. And my husband Paul said to me, "You can't do it, it wouldn't be fair." So he very kindly went with a member of their staff to identify Neil's body.
Just for the record, I understand that your husband Paul has passed on. If you can indicate when he passed on.
My husband passed on in May 2016. He died of cancer.
Can we talk a little bit about the reaction and how the family responded to the death? You've already mentioned that your father took Neil's death in a very bad way. That's set out in your affidavit as well. But then you had heard the police version that he had committed suicide. What was your response to that and the response of your family?
My response, and that of my family, was definitely he would never have committed suicide. He was a strong man, and I couldn't imagine that he could ever take his own life. I couldn't imagine that. He had a loving family, he had loving friends, and he knew he meant the world to us.
So that was your view back in 1982, and that of your family members. And over time, has your view changed in any way?
Never. Never.
So what do you believe in your heart happened, Mrs. Berger?
I believe that Neil was severely tortured, and I think there's been a lot of evidence pointing to that fact. And I think, and this is my thoughts, that he was so severely tortured that accidentally he died. They killed him.
Mrs. Berger, you had to have discussions with your lawyers as to the approach to be taken in the first inquest. Could you indicate to the court the contents of those discussions and what was put to you by the lawyers at that time?
As the period wore on before the date of the inquest, the discussions with our lawyers, with Mr. Bezos, Mr. Lane, and with other legal representatives, was that they felt that perhaps it was easier to lead evidence by accepting that it was suicide, but that in fact it was induced suicide. They had reduced this proud, strong man to such a degree of insanity, really, that he had taken his own life, and much against our will, and especially my father, who never believed that Neil took his own life. We agreed, for the sake of the inquest, which we had hoped would open up the truth about what was going on in the security police cells in this country.
Mrs. Berger, did you attend the first inquest?
I attended most of the days. I attended the first day, and most days. There were times I couldn't, but I probably only missed 5 days. It was a very long inquest and only ended, I think, in November or December that year. It was very long, but I attended most days.
And can you give the court your comments and your thoughts about those proceedings? It was quite intimidating, because a lot of security policemen used to attend this court, and there was an arrogance that I found quite intimidating. My friend who's in this court today, Mrs. Grant Marshall, was with me, and we used to, at lunchtime when the court adjourned, go and take lunch together, and often there was a sort of sneering attitude that they gave me and my friend, which I found quite intimidating. But bit by bit, as the affidavits from the different detainees came through, especially in those first few weeks, I think it broke my mother's heart. She couldn't bear to read another thing. When other detainees described how they saw Neil and what state he was in, she too collapsed. It was too much. Mrs. Berger, sitting in that first inquest court day after day, were you of the view that it was an exercise aimed at reaching the truth, or do you have other views of those proceedings?
I certainly think our legal team was trying to reach the truth. They worked very hard towards the truth. However, there were very, very different views coming from the witnesses brought forward by counsel representing the police. Some of the policemen got terribly tied up during their witness statements and being asked questions by counsel, and it was fairly evident that they had been coached to give a certain narrative of the events that happened, and that sometimes they got into such a tangle that they sort of tripped over themselves during questioning, and it was fairly evident that that was the case.
So at the end of those proceedings, how were you and your family feeling once the judgment had been handed down?
in a strange way, we sort of expected it. Because we knew by the denials that the government continued to pour out, right from the very top, from the Prime Minister all the way down to the Minister for the Police, the Minister for Prison, everybody, the magistrate who had supposedly visited Neil or hadn't visited him, to the magistrate who presided over the first inquest. There was a negative attitude constantly, and a denial, constant denial, that anything had gone wrong. So we suspected that there would probably be no other outcome other than that was given. But we didn't believe it. And I do think an awful lot of people did not believe the final outcome.
If we can turn to the conduct of the police, and in particular the security branch at that time. At any point in time, did you and your family members feel that you were being monitored or observed by the police, and if so, in what manner?
Certainly in our own home in Irene, Pretoria, our phone was tapped. It was fairly obvious because you could hear the click. Our post was looked at. Often it would come with a little paperclip on it where it had been opened. And regularly there'd be a car parked outside our drive. And I can only assume it was... I never challenged the person, but I can only assume we were being monitored. But then, during this time, my parents were actually staying with me in Irene, and I had a phone call, a very, very strange phone call, asking... I can't even remember what he asked, but it was a very strange phone call. And we then realised that it was a man called Paul Erasmus, who was actually in my parents' home, phoning me from their home. And he had entered their house illegally and was searching for, we were told, for documents about Neil. But it was a very bizarre thing that he phoned me and asked me how my parents were doing, I think. How was I doing? How was my parents doing? It was a very bizarre conversation, and I put the phone down, bewildered.
So was this after the death?
This was after the death, during the preparations that the legal teams were making towards the inquest, my lord.
And indeed, thank you for raising that, Mrs. Berger, because I was coming to it. Before we talk about it in more detail, did he identify himself on the phone?
No, but he did give me a name. And it wasn't Paul Erasmus, it was Peter Elliott, or a name again I can't remember, but it was not Paul Erasmus, I know that.
But you learned subsequently that the person on the phone was in fact Paul Erasmus?
I do believe so, yes.
And anything else about the conversation? Anything aside inquiring about your parents' well-being?
I don't remember very much about it, I'm afraid. It was just a bizarre... strange things were happening around us constantly. We had the media very much focused on ourselves. Journalists would phone up and ask questions. People would come knocking on the door. We were, in a sense, besieged. So getting this strange phone call wasn't that unusual, if I can just say that. Sort of trying to pick information out of us without truly identifying themselves.
So you came to learn that the police had entered your parents' home illegally.
Yes.
Did you establish why they had done that? What they were doing in your parents' home?
No, not at the time. No. We had no idea what they were looking for. We had been warned by our legal counsel that we must be very cautious about talking about the inquest on the phone, and generally we must be very cautious about locking up our homes carefully so that no one could break in, because there was I think counsel suspected that the police might do something to try and learn how the family was going to be represented at the inquest.
So in fact, we will be leading evidence to demonstrate that this was a security branch operation authorized at a high level. And the evidence will also demonstrate that they were searching for something or another to justify the claimed version that Neil had committed suicide. And indeed, it wasn't only the family home that they visited, there were other places as well, including his former school. What is your reaction to that operation, that they were attempting to find evidence of so-called suicidal tendencies on the part of Neil?
Initially, disbelief. You couldn't imagine a police force being so desperate that they had to resort to criminal activity, actually, because they broke into my parents' home without my parents' knowledge, to obtain information that surely was not relevant. If Neil had been psychologically damaged and was therefore a suicide risk, they would have found out that long ago. And why would they need proof by looking into my parents' home? I was bewildered by this fact, totally bewildered.
And it raised deep suspicions. Did it raise deep suspicions in your mind and the minds of your family as to why they would go to such lengths?
Oh, absolutely. Deep suspicions, and made us even more, can I say, paranoid, to keep ourselves to ourselves and not to say anything or let out any information that might be of they might use in some way against Neil, which was, or despite the fact that he died, it was, they were trying to ruin his reputation and it was very distressing.
Did you know who accompanied Mr. Paul Erasmus on that operation?
I subsequently learned who it was.
Could you indicate to the court who it was?
It was Mr. Stephen Whitehead, my lord, and he subsequently was charged in the Somerset West Magistrates Court for breaking into, entering my parents' home without Stephen Whitehead and Paul Erasmus. Yes.
The evidence that we will lead, the Lord will show that Paul Erasmus was in fact convicted and given a light sentence for entering the Aggett home. But as far as we can recall, and we will double check that, Whitehead himself was never charged or convicted.
Was convicted of housebreaking or was convicted of trespass? What was it?
We will double check, but it would either have been illegal trespass or it would have been housebreaking. The evidence, I believe, will demonstrate that Mr. Erasmus tricked the domestic servant into allowing him to gain access to the home. At that time, there was nobody else present at home. Mr. Erasmus will be, in fact, appearing before your lordship, and he will be the witness of the state.
Okay.
Mrs. Berger, did you get to hear of the monitoring of your own lawyers by the security branch?
Much, much later I got to hear of that, yes. But I think not before the end of the inquest.
I see. And we will also be leading evidence in this regard from Mr. Erasmus. What was your response to hear that the police were bugging the officers and phones of your senior counsel and attorneys?
Despite it being an extraordinary fact, I wasn't amazed or shocked because I understood that this was their modus operandi. and by then I had accepted that they were prepared to do almost anything.
For the record, you've indicated when your husband passed away. For the court record, could you also indicate when your parents passed away, as well as your brother Michael?
My brother Michael died in 2010. My father, I believe, in 1996, and my mother in 2006.
And how did you feel knowing that they had gone to their graves, having to live with an official finding that you regarded as manifestly false?
When I learnt that my father was severely ill, I travelled immediately from England to be by his bedside. And my elder brother and I sat on either side of him, holding his hand. And one of his last words, his dying wish, he said, "I just hope they get those bastards one day." That he had preyed on his mind for all those years. And he would talk about it, he would mutter to himself, "Those bastards." He never believed that Neil committed suicide. He always believed he'd been murdered. My father went to his grave hoping that one day the truth would emerge.
Mrs. Berger, we sincerely hope that in these proceedings we will get to the truth of what happened to Neil. Do you have a reaction to the fact that it has taken some 38 years, and since the advent of democracy, some 26 years, to get to this point today?
I'm truly shocked. I'm truly shocked. I so rejoiced when this country became a democracy. And I thought it stood out as a paragon of virtue when the Constitution was written. We all had high hopes, and at that stage I thought there would be some reckoning of how the bullies and the security police treated so many people, not only my brother, but many, many, many others, people who had no recourse to legal aid or legal help in any way, and whose loved ones died in the most terrible way. And it shocks me now still that it's taken so long for the state to look back at these crimes. And I'm just so grateful to the NPA now that they have in fact brought forward this inquest so that we can perhaps one day learn the truth.
Are there any particular questions that you and your family would like this court to look into and to answer?
As I mentioned to His Lordship right at the beginning, I think we're all seeking the truth about Neil's death and how he died, but I do believe I'd love to know why they pursued him so relentlessly before he was detained, and once he was in detention. It appeared that he had nothing left to give, and yet they continued to torture and harass him unbelievably beyond his life. And I can never understand that and the reason why. And one of the reasons I'm very sad that Mr. Stephen Whitehead has died is I think perhaps he is the only one who holds the truth. I don't know.
And we've heard how Stephen Whitehead, who was, at least for a period of time, the chief interrogator of Neill Aggett, he passed away during April of 2019, only last year, in the very week that the Minister of Justice announced that the inquest would be reopened. What was your reaction and that of your family to the death of Mr. Whitehead at that particular time?
I actually heard about the reopening of the inquest before I was told that Stephen Whitehead passed away. My immediate reaction was incredibly happy to hear that the inquest had been reopened. I mean, truly relieved and happy that it had done so. Then when I heard that Mr. Whitehead had passed away, my first thought was, he's either gone somewhere to hide, so that he could not be at this inquest giving evidence, or he himself has committed suicide because he couldn't face the truth. But I subsequently learned that he died of natural causes. And the only implication I can get from that is that he had made some sort of deal with somebody along the line that the inquest would not be opened in his lifetime. And that is the conclusion I've come to.
Would you want this court to confirm his death, at least through the inspection of his unabridged death certificate?
I would indeed, my lord.
Sorry?
I would indeed welcome
Okay.
a look at the unabridged version of his death certificate, please.
Mrs. Berger, do you have any thoughts around how Neill Aggett should be commemorated? And I pose this question knowing that this court is not in a position to make any such order, but for the public record, if you have any views or ideas on what could be done.
This sounds very selfish, but it would be wonderful if Neil were commemorated in the medical field. He was a fine doctor, recognised by many as a very competent doctor. He studied at UCT, at Critiscure, and the medical school there, but he also worked at some very big hospitals, Tembisa, Baragwanath, and for one of those institutions to hold his name would be an enormous honour, because at the end of the day he was a passionate doctor as well as a passionate trade unionist, and a man of great integrity, I believe.
Well, Baragwanath has been renamed already. So
Has it?
Baragwanath has been renamed already.
I come from England. I'm afraid I wasn't aware of that, my lord. I do apologise.
Yes.
But
Right.
perhaps Tembisa,
Yeah,
perhaps we can make an inquiry as to whether Tembisa is Mrs. Berger, we're almost at the end of your evidence. Is there anything further that you would wish to add?
I would like to have on record my great gratitude to the NPA for reopening this inquest, and to the legal team who's sitting here in front of me, who have worked tirelessly and have produced the most extraordinary amount of evidence to prove how Neil died and why he died. I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you very much.
My lord, just for the record, my learned junior advises me that Tembisa Hospital hasn't been renamed.
Yes,
My lord, I have no further questions.
Yes. Any questions from May I proceed?
Thank you, my lord.
Yes.
Madam, on behalf of my colleague, learned colleague to my right, Victor Nochua, my colleague to the left, Dr. Kamanani, and myself, we would like to say that we are incredibly sorry to you and your family for your loss. I know it's 38 years too late, but we are committed and we will endeavour to ensure that your family, or that you and your family, get the closure that you need.
Thank you very
I
much.
just have a few questions for you. When Dr. Aggett contacted you and told you that he had been arrested, did he tell you who had arrested him in particular? Can you recall?
Only the security police. He did name the security police as far as I remember, because I knew then what type of arrest it was. If it had been a criminal offence, which I knew, and he did mention the law under which he had been arrested. It used to be the 90 days law, but I can't recall what it was called at the time, but that he'd been arrested under that particular law by the security police, but no names.
Thank you. But he did say it was a security branch.
Yes.
When you heard security branch, what went through your mind and why?
Huge dread. I was very aware of people who had died under detention. It was well known, and there's some very, very well known people who died in those sort of circumstances. I call to mind Steve Biko. And it was considered a very, very dangerous place to be if you were under security police detention. Yes.
When you visited, you and your mum visited the one and only time you visited Dr. Aggett, was there a specific procedure that was followed for you to visit, apart from the fact that there was a policeman that was seated in close proximity to you and your mum? Were you just allowed to come in? Were you allowed to bring articles? Can you just explain to the court?
No, we were met downstairs in some sort of reception room. I can't say we were searched, but certainly I can't imagine we'd have been allowed to bring anything up to him. We may have even had our handbags searched. That I can't recall very clearly, but we were certainly escorted all the way. We were never free of an escort.
I know this is a bit a far shot, but I just wanted to find out. Now, 31st of December, one would assume that it's quite hot during that time period. Can you recall what the weather was like that time? Was it hot, cold? Can you recall?
It wasn't extremely hot. It was, I could think, a normal temperature. I can't recall anything other than that. We were probably wearing summer clothes.
From what you've testified, it would appear that Neil shared quite a close relationship with, in particular, your mum. Would I be correct to say that?
I would say yes. I would say he and my mum he was her youngest child. They were very close. But communicating with her was quite difficult when there'd been the split between my father and Neil. It hadn't affected me, fortunately, because I was living separately then. But it affected my mother deeply, and they did communicate regularly.
Would I be correct then to say that what Neil did would have had a direct effect on your mum emotionally? Can you comment?
Oh yes, it would have affected her emotionally. She was very anxious about Neil and the work he did. But when I spoke earlier about the weekend he spent with us, which was such a joy, and one of the things she used to laugh about was that he cooked us all a lovely breakfast, for example, and it was just a lovely family time, although my father was not there. She was very, very attached to Neil. Very.
Now, the 1980s in particular, the earlier part of, let's call it what it is, apartheid was a tumultuous time period for South Africa. Neil's general affiliation, or his caring for the way that he did for people of all races, coming from a very conservative community, in your view, how would that have come across to other people?
Well, to my father's friends, who too were very conservative, the reaction then, and I'm ashamed to say this, was he got what he deserved. I'm truly ashamed to say that. But I do have to say that my father never spoke to those particular friends again. To me, I had a lot of liberal friends who were very committed. I wouldn't say they were activists, but they certainly belonged to Black Sash, voted for the Progressive Party, which was all we could do in those days. We're great admirers of Helen Suzman. My circle moved in that was the circle I moved in personally. My parents certainly were not nationalist voters. They too recognised the brutality and the tremendous unfairness that was going on. So his version of the life he was leading was accepted.
You testified, you told this court that this Kutsia gentleman that had come to you had made it very clear that they privileged, and that your visit was actually a privilege. Can you just elaborate a bit further?
Just in the way we were gathered together and herded in, herded out, as though we were just a group who had the privilege to come and visit the great General Coetzee. And why would a bunch of people like us not think that they were having the best treatment? They were under his wing, and he was assured us that there wasn't going to be a hair on their heads hurt by the police force that he was in charge of.
You also testified that there was a time when Dr. Aggett was in Cape Town. Do you know in particular which address it was, or which part of Cape Town it was?
I believe Miss Floyd is going to give some evidence, and she can tell you, because they did cohabit then, and they didn't really have an address, to be honest, because for a long time they lived in a workers' college on a wine estate in Constantia, Cape Town, in very humble circumstances. So I shouldn't think it had an address.
No, that's fine. Then just one last question. When your mom and dad lived at the home that you testified that was broken into by the security branch, was it just your parents that were living at that address?
Yes, and a domestic worker.
Can you recall her name?
I think it was Joanna.
Was it Joanna?
I think so, but I could be wrong. It's a long time ago.
Okay, and that would be where? In Somerset West?
That was in Somerset West.
Please have a moment. Does the name Sarah ring a bell?
Oh, yeah. You're absolutely right. It was Sarah. Johanna worked for them previously. Thank you.
Well, I have no further questions for the witness.
Have a good day.
Thank you, my lord. Mrs. Berger, as you might be aware, I appear on behalf of police officers that might be implicated in this instance, in this evidence before the court. May I just say that on behalf of myself and my attorney, this is our job to do. I have great feelings for the loss of any relative under any circumstances, and most definitely as you have experienced.
Thank you.
So my questioning is not an attack or a justification. It is merely to find out facts.
Thank you.
The first, during the meeting that you had with Dr. Aggett on December the 31st, 1981, were you allowed to take anything to him? Anything at all?
I can't remember being prohibited from taking anything. We may have been. I'm not sure. But we certainly didn't take anything to him. And that may have been as a result of being asked not to bring anything, or it may just have been that we arrived and came as we were.
And to ask this, for example, just you didn't have cookies with him, some tea with him, or anything edible that you took with you?
Can I just say, my lord, that the previous weeks I had been delivering parcels to John Vorster Square down at the basement, or downstairs somewhere. There was a collection point where we used to put parcels, and I had assumed that Neil was receiving these parcels. There was fruit juice, cookies, things that he might enjoy to supplement his police station diet, really. And I had no sort of thought that he might not be getting these parcels.
So your recollection is that you did not enjoy any eatery with him there?
No, we sat the whole time clutching each of his hands.
In your statement in paragraph 13, you mentioned that he made detailed complaints about the abuse, that he was seeking a reckoning. If I can read it directly there. Where is it, do you refer to the statement that he made shortly before his death?
That's correct.
That the statement?
Yes.
Mrs. Berger, obviously you most likely the person that knew him the best. What was his general attitude towards his personal life? Some people are very close-knit in their personal life, doesn't share information freely, or will not tell people about their personal life and experiences. Was he a person that will easily talk about his life, and especially you say in relation to his relationship with his dad, for example?
Yes, his relationship with his dad had been difficult, yes, but it had been warming. They had met several times before he was arrested. But your question is about Neil as a person. He was very quietly spoken, and I would say he didn't divulge a lot about himself.
A private person.
Quite a private person. Passionate, uncompromising, and very strong.
And did he like the debate, to debate with people? With people not with arguments, but to discuss issues vibrantly?
I'm sure he did with his friends. He didn't with me necessarily, but he used to give me books. Not that I read them all, because they were quite hard reading, but philosophical books about families and whether families were the right way that humans should develop. I mean, very deep philosophical books he used to give me to read. So he was a very deep thinker. And I can't say that he discussed things there was no reason to argue with me, because I had no reason to argue with him. I supported his way of life and his commitment and the way he was going.
If I say argue, perhaps it's not the right word, but to debate issues. In other words, that he will be easily drawn into a debate on issues.
I don't think with me he was, no.
When I see also in your statement in paragraph 8, you refer to the discussion you had when the police intervened in the discussion on this meeting. There you indicate that he indicated that he believed he was going to be in detention for another 6 months. Is that what you mean by a short period? I'm not just trying to
I think the words were probably no more than. That the investigation would take no more than. He'd already been in 3 months. I knew of people who'd been in there for many years. So to 6 months, although the conditions and the idea of him being there was abhorrent to me, I realised that 6 months was not necessarily a very long time to be in detention.
And once you have starting to prepare after the death of Dr. Aggett, you basically immediately employ the services of medical professionals, pathologists to oversee and to also jointly partake in the examination of the deceased body. Dr. Vorster, I believe it was.
That is correct, and that was on the advice of our attorneys.
That was my next question. Was he known to you?
No.
Or to Dr. Aggett? He was not?
No. I believe our initial request for a pathologist, whom we knew through family, and he was a partner of Dr. Vorster's, and he was away at the time, and Dr. Vorster came in place of him.
At that stage, and I think it was common fact that it was a difficult stage to go against the government, but you had doctors and lawyers that were prepared to take on the government, and especially the security branch at that stage during the early 80s. Was that one of the reasons why Dr. Vorster was used? Because he was a person that was prepared to take on the security branch, or to take on the government of that day, in giving a truthful account as to what he observed. In other words, he's not a hired gun by the apartheid government. He's a person that you and your legal team believe was a person that will honestly and competently do a thorough investigation of the circumstances?
I'm sorry, my lord, I can't answer that because it wasn't a decision that I could make. I knew no pathologists at all, and I had no idea of the character or the political persuasions of Dr. Vorster. As I say, initially the phone call was made by my legal representatives to another gentleman who we knew vaguely because my cousin had been a friend of his son's, something to that degree. And beyond that, I had no knowledge of Dr. Vorster at all.
Now, I have read the evidence by Dr. Vorster and also his report that was made available to the extent it was made available. The findings by Dr. Vorster, were you and your legal team satisfied with those findings? Or did you have problems with the findings of Dr. Vorster as he put in his report and as he testified?
Again, I find it very difficult to answer that because we were so traumatized. My family and I were so traumatized by what had happened to Neil that just reading the report of the post-mortem was so traumatic. We had no view. Well, I speak for myself, not for my family. I had no view on whether it was a thorough post-mortem or not. I could not give you a view on that.
So I'm not going to deal with the report with you because I don't think that's appropriate. I'm sure it will be dealt with on other. I just wanted to ask you whether there was at that stage any concern that you, your legal team, or your family raised in relation to the report and the findings in this report.
I was not aware of any.
Then, a difficult question. And I'm not sure whether it is answerable, but persons committing suicide, it is very difficult to say it is impossible that a person will commit suicide. And the circumstances in which his life was and under which he was detained, and also his involvement at that stage with other people, all of that will have an influence on his decision making in relation to his life. Do you agree with that?
Possibly, but he was he knew what he believed, and he was a very strong man. And I don't think that would have changed.
Thank you, my Lord. Thank you, Mrs. Berger. Don't have further questions.
No questions.
No questions. Ms. Berger, I just want to find out.
My Lord, with your leave, I wonder if I could pose two questions on re-examination.
Yes, before I'll give you an examination once I have time.
As the court please.
So maybe do that. Just do an examination.
Okay. Mrs. Berger, just to assist the court on a few matters. In relation to the parcels that you had been delivering, that you mentioned in response to questions from my learned friend, you mentioned that these were fruit, juice, cookies, and the like. And of course, you didn't know for sure whether they were getting through or not.
I assumed they were.
Yes. Were there any items over time that you might have put in parcels beyond edibles?
No.
Books, other items of clothing?
I can't remember ever having put in anything other than, for myself, what I put in. He had made a request for a radio, and I was in the process of actually purchasing a radio to bring to him. But before that happened, we learnt of his death.
Yes. And my friend has put quite a few questions to you in relation to the family's medical expert at the time, Professor Vorster. And you have indicated to the court that, in fact, the family's lawyers had originally approached another pathologist. Would I be right in saying that that pathologist was Dr. Gluckman?
Correct.
Dr. Who?
Gluckman.
Gluckman.
Yeah. I believe the spelling is Gluckman. And at that time he was regarded as a leading preeminent pathologist.
Yes.
So would I be correct in saying that Dr. Vorster was in fact the second choice because
Yes.
Gluckman was not available?
Yes.
Thank you, Mother.
What I want to find out from you is on the day when you visited Neill at the police station, besides yourself and your mother and Neil and the police officer was keeping guard, did any other police officer enter the office where you were sitting?
I don't remember anybody, my lord.
But he managed to tell you that. Did he tell you why he was arrested? He was being detained.
No, he didn't.
He did not.
No.
Now, tell me, the day when the police officer arrived to inform you about the death, you said it was very early.
It was.
Did he give you an indication, and it was in Pretoria that you are?
Yes.
Did he give you an indication when that happened? It was very early, 5:30 in the morning. But did he tell you where this happened, the day before, or at midnight, or?
My lord, I think he probably said earlier this morning.
Earlier?
Yes. He had been given the information by Johannesburg Police. He was based in Pretoria. He knew nothing of the case. He knew nothing about Neil. He was literally being used as a messenger.
The Johannesburg Police sent him there.
Correct.
When the parent support group met and were given a hearing by, we don't know whether to call him Brigadier Kutsie, where he reassured you that all is well, nothing will happen to them.
Yes.
Now, subsequent to his death, did you manage to have a hearing with him again to find out, well,
No.
this has now happened?
No.
You never met him again?
Do you know, I believe, my lord, that if we had asked, there would not have been that window of opportunity. I don't think we were even tempted to ask.
Now, I know that you told the court that you managed to get permission for a visit which took place on the 31st of December.
Mm-hmm.
Subsequent to that, did you request any other visit thereafter? And if so, when and why was it refused or not refused?
We were certainly, before that event and subsequently afterwards, there was regular phone calls made to the police station asking for further visits. And each time we were told that something was being done about it, but never an absolute answer. There was a constant, it's a long time ago and I can't remember what the route was, but certainly there were regular requests to have visits by all the families of the detainees. We were regularly being asked, asking if we could have further visits. I'm not sure how those phone calls went. I had made phone calls to the police station and been told that it was being looked at.
Is there any particular police officer in that security department that you spoke to asking for further visits?
No, I'm not aware of anybody's name. And I even then, I probably wasn't aware of anybody's name.
Thank you. Any questions arising out of the questions that
None, my lord.
No further questions.
Ms. Vera, thank you very much for your information.
Thank you, my lord. Thank you. Thank you.
You're excused.
Thank you very much.
I see the time is 20 to 1. Do you want to call? Is there any other person to call into?
My lord, we're in your hands. We have Mr. Dyson, who is waiting outside, the attorney at the time. We're either happy to proceed or to...
Yeah, no, we can proceed to 1 o'clock.
My lord, before we proceed with Mr. Dyson, and I should add my learned junior, Mr. Ty Scott, will be leading Mr. Dyson in evidence. With the court's leave, I wish to seek clarity on the mandate enjoyed by my learned friends for Mr. Deerclips.
Yeah.
I'm a little troubled by the claimed mandate that our learned friends are representing police officers who may be implicated. It was indicated to us at the beginning that they were representing Mr. Deerclips, and we accept that they do have such a mandate. They did indicate that perhaps down the road they might get further mandates. My lord, until they get those mandates, it's unclear to me how they are able to represent unknown individual police officers who may be implicated, particularly since it is clear, as has already been conceded by my learned friend, that there may very well be conflicts between these police officers. So, my lord, we do seek clarity as to the exact mandate, because we don't see how it is legally possible to enjoy a mandate for unknown police officers who may be implicated in the future. From what I can understand, currently they simply enjoy a mandate from Mr. Deerclips, and at a future occasion they may or may not enjoy mandates from other specific identified officers.
Yes, that's
My learned freedom is quite correct. I have currently, and through my attorney, an instruction to act on behalf of Mr. Deerclips, who is a person that's implicated in this, who might be implicated in this inquest. Lord, but my instruction is also that should some of the people who were police officers at that stage, come to court and might be implicated, that we should ascertain first of all whether there is a conflict of interest. If there is indeed, I cannot appear for them, and we cannot take instructions from them, and they will be entitled to their legal representation apart from us, apart from me. But in general, and if maybe I put it too widely to the witness, I did it for clarity's sake only, is that my role here is for, if a person is implicated, and if he wishes to have legal representation, and if there is no conflict of interest, and if it is then my instruction, I will act for them. And that is the long and the short of my mandate that is here at court. I do not want to present to the court that I am acting on behalf of unknown, unmentioned, and unidentified persons.
Let me just find out, from the documentation in your possession, do you have names of police officers that you know are implicated?
Judge, there might be. I don't want to discuss the legal argument in relation to what would be implicated and what will be to be held liable, but there is definitely some police officers that are mentioned here that has to answer to some aspects from what happened there. And to the extent that that might be implicated, it will depend on the evidence. I cannot, and neither can my attorney, approach a person to say to him, I see that your names are mentioned here, I see that you might be implicated, can we represent you? I cannot do that because then I'm charging for work and that I'm not allowed to do. But my general instruction from the police is that should there be members who might be implicated and who wish to have legal representation and whose interests are not conflicted with Detlef's, that I may then get instructions to represent them.
In the future.
In the future. But it is, I don't know whether such instructions will come, and I don't know whether, even if it comes, whether they would want me to represent them. They might want their own lawyers, and for that reason I cannot anticipate who, what and where they might join the party if they do.
My Lord, I'm indebted to the clarity afforded by my learned friend. So from what he is saying, my Lord, as we currently stand, he enjoys a single mandate from a single police officer. So, my Lord, I would respectfully ask that he not indicate that he's representing the interests of police officers who may be implicated. Currently, he only enjoys the mandate of a single police officer to the extent that that police officer, Mr. Detlefs, is implicated, and he's here to represent the interests of that particular police officer. And, my Lord, it's common cause that under Rule 7 of the Uniform Rules of the High Court, that until his team enjoys power of attorney from specific individuals, they are not here representing other individuals. They're simply representing the interests of Mr. Detlefs.
Thank you. I take it that you're representing, are you representing the police officers who are implicated or not?
Lord, I'm here merely on a watching brief to represent the interests of the current police force.
Of the current police force?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Not of police officers who may be implicated.
My Lord, my mandate and my instruction thus far does not reach that far, my Lord. I'm here as a state, my Lord, merely on a watching brief to assist the court where necessary and represent the interests of the current police service, my Lord. We have not received any instruction in relation to the representation of past police officials which may be implicated in this inquest.
Thank you. I think that's clear. That's clear.
As the court pleases, and thank you for allowing us to clear that matter up. Lord, I'm just looking at the time. We are in position to proceed, but if you prefer to adjourn...
It's up to you. We still have about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. All right, well, let's make use of that time. Lord, I will be stepping aside to allow my learned junior to take us through the evidence of Mr. Dyson.
In which language will you testify in?
English.
Please state your full name and surname for the record.
David Dyson.
Do you have any objection in taking the prescribed oath?
No.
Do you swear that the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
You have been sworn.
Our Lord, as the court pleases, we've prepared a statement for Mr. Dyson. We've handed it to our colleagues. If there's no objection, might I hand it up, and I believe its annexure number would be G3. Mr. Dyson, do you confirm that the affidavit I've handed in deposed to by yourself, that's now been marked as Exhibit G3, signed by yourself on the 21st of January, do you confirm that affidavit's contents?
I do.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Dyson, in what capacity did you know the late Dr. Neill Aggett?
I was a very good friend of his and Liz Floyd's when they came up to Johannesburg in the 70s, in 77, 78. Neil had a particular interest in workers' rights. He was up here on behalf of the African Food and Canning Workers Union. And so he used to come to a place where I did voluntary work on behalf of the Industrial Aid Society here in Bree Street. And we used to assist workers with their rights in relation to workmen's compensation, UIF, dismissal, and unions, because black workers were beginning to flex their muscles and join union. They had added rights post the Vihan Commission, and Neil was particularly committed to building a strong union.
And having known him as a friend and worked with him in these organizations, what was the sense you got that inspired this passion?
Well, he was an incredibly humane person. He was totally dedicated. He was a brilliant doctor, but he was prepared to sacrifice a medical career because he believed that black workers were terribly disadvantaged, and he had a great feeling for upliftment of the working class. And my impression of him was that he was just, as you can see from the massive support that he's had for this inquest 38 years later, that he was just a very, very powerful, committed individual. Everybody who knew him liked him. He had no enemies. And he and Liz brought a kind of rigor to Johannesburg from UCT and from Cape Town that we really hadn't seen before. He was close to the leadership of the Food and Canning Workers Union, Jan Teron, Atherley Crawford, Oscar Mpeta, and they were building a Johannesburg branch of this famous old union that had been essentially decimated by apartheid anti-black union positions in the 50s and the 60s.
So as part of those activities, what were Neil's day-to-day commitments to the union? What did he engage in?
Well, he was very carefully dedicating himself to becoming highly skilled. He was a doctor, but he was now learning all about workers' rights. So, for instance, when we had medical cases at the Industrial Aid Society, he would come in and assist with claims and workmen's compensation issues and health issues. And he was very involved in the notion of the unions developing a medical and health element. And I believe that's the route he would have got if he had lived.
Mr. Dyson, you yourself were also part of the Industrial Aid Society.
Yes, I was.
And what sort of activities did you participate in?
Essentially, we were young apprentice lawyers. I was attached at one stage to the Legal Resources Centre as a clerk, and then I moved to Belgium Hall in 1980. But we were assisting unrepresented black workers who were pouring into the Industrial Aid Society offices, from which people like Gavin Anderson and Sipho Kubeka had organized the Metal and Allied Workers Union. The Heinemann strike took place in 76, which George Bezos defended Gavin and Sipho on. They had been banned. That union ultimately became NUMSA today. There was a crowd of people around the Industrial Aid Society, which had been developed by the New SAS Wages Commission back in the 70s. So it was a workers' advice centre.
And as a progressive young lawyer who was working in the area of workers' rights at that time, what sort of cases did you take on?
Essentially, it was about dismissal and persons who were dismissed for organizing trade union activities or for some form of collective bargaining attempt at work.
Now, Mr. Dyson, having regard to Dr. Aggett's activities in the union, did you have any sense of what his political leanings were?
I didn't really. I mean, he was obviously part of the progressive forces that wanted change in South Africa, very much part of that. But I had no sense of his membership of a political organization.
And what sort of lifestyle did Dr. Aggett lead, Mr. Dyson?
he led a Spartan lifestyle. He made money by doing emergency work at Baragwanath and other hospitals. So he was a skilled emergency medicine practitioner. But he would do that. He would do that on the weekends or on Saturday nights, where he would sometimes come to my house on Sunday mornings, having treated 30 or 40 cases at Baragwanath, axes in the head, stabbings, shootings, and he was highly skilled as that kind of a medical practitioner. But his day to day, or his commitment, was to building the union.
So you'd say between those two activities, he was a fairly busy person.
Very. But he was sociable as well. He was very well liked. He was well liked in Crown Mines, in Judas Paul, in Kensington, where all the students and the postgraduate people lived. So he loved Johannesburg.
So Mr. Dyson, it's known that you were actually the attorney for the Aggett family.
Well,
I'd like to ask you some questions regarding that.
Sure.
When or in what circumstances did Neil or the Aggett family or any member approach you for legal assistance?
Well, before he went in, Neil had a chat with me, and it was known that there was this close comrades letter, which is part of the record. And it was he had a sense that he would be picked up because it was known. He knew that his name was on that list. And we chatted about it. He had no fears about it, other than the rigours of being detained under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, which the others already were, knowing that would be solitary confinement and interrogation. So he was obviously apprehensive about that, but he was calm. In his view, there was nothing that he had to answer for, and he was perfectly legitimate in all the work that he was doing.
And indeed he was then arrested, as he had communicated his fear.
Yeah, he was arrested towards the end of November with Liz, and after about 2 weeks he ended up in John Vorster Square.
And at that time, having had that conversation with him, did you step up? Were there any sort of tasks to assist him?
Essentially, Jill Berger and the family would bring parcels, and we would take them down to John Vorster Square. But we weren't allowed to communicate with the detainees. And because I was close to Liz and Neil, I effectively became their attorney. I was a junior attorney at Belgian Hall, and there was very little that I could do other than taking parcels, because there was no access for attorney.
So you couldn't consult with them?
I could not consult with them. No.
You could not even telephonically consult?
In no way.
Okay.
And I never did.
And did you also assist Liz?
Yeah. Similarly, I mean, there were huge support groups. There was the Detainees Parents Support Committee that Audrey and Max Coleman had got together because their son Keith was in detention. And so there was a very organized grouping of support that took parcels and reading material and radios to the detainees in boxes, and I think that they were deposited with Sergeant Zeely at the bottom.
The original inquest judgment mentioned something about Dr. Aggett wanting a radio.
Yes.
Do you have any comment on?
I have no recollection about that, and I don't know why he didn't get a radio, but I have no memory of that.
How did you come to learn of Dr. Aggett's death, Mr. Dyson?
In the early hours of the morning of the 5th of February, Jill Berger called me and told me.
And what was her state?
She was obviously shocked, and so were we. Yeah.
And what was your impression?
Well, as far as we were concerned, it an absolute abomination, and whether he took his own life or whether he was murdered was irrelevant. In our view, it was disgraceful.
And why did Jill see fit to call you, David?
Well, I think she wanted me to do something about this, and I immediately went to my senior partner, William Lane, and told him what had happened. And he called in George Bezos, and Bezos called in Dennis Cooney, who was assisted by Mohammed Nafsa, and William kind of captained the team, and we built a team around this inquest.
And this team, what was the purpose or goal of the team?
Well, the purpose was
the mandate, or what was the mandate?
the mandate was to represent the Aggett family in their efforts to establish how Neill died, and we began to take instructions in that regard.
Did the family have a view of how he died?
The family were adamant that he had been killed and murdered. As we looked at the system at John Vorster Square, and we began to take statements from all the detainees that we could get access to, it appeared that there had been systematic torture. Not just solitary confinement, but continual interrogation of targeted people, moving from Orette van Heerden, Barbara Hogan, and then finally Neill seemed to be getting it in the neck from what we were getting from the detainees, and we were taking statements from them. So the general picture that we got was that Neill was getting heavily interrogated, and through piecing together occurrence books and other bits of evidence, we worked out that he had had a particularly long session of interrogation towards the end of January, beginning of February.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. We'll explore your investigations in a moment. You mentioned earlier that William Lane had, the senior partner, had called Advocate George Bezos SC.
Yes.
Why did Mr. Lane see fit to brief Advocate Bezos on the matter?
I think George was the most senior person in relation to detainee deaths, particularly since he had been the advocate in the Biko matter, and he was a very experienced human rights and political case lawyer. And he was the kind of person who knew how to be tough with the special branch. He understood the special branch. He understood how they worked, and he was experienced and tough.
So would it be fair to say he was the leader of the team?
Yes.
And what was the strategy that he adopted?
It was a very fraught strategy. We had very long discussions about what line we should take. Jan Botha, the pathologist that we hired, who was Dr. Gluckman's partner, Gluckman wasn't well at that stage, gave the impression that it could have been self-inflicted. But didn't make come to a final conclusion on that. And with the kind of evidence that we were picking up from the detainees, there was a sense that Neill had been in a very poor state. And so strategically we took the position that this was a forced suicide, an induced suicide. We didn't have the evidence that we now seem to be getting and that we got at the TRC years later, which indicated that there had been a massive cover-up. So we took the line also on the basis that there was all these other detainees, and it was very important for them who had been tortured in John Vorster Square to come forward and give similar fact evidence. The magistrate Kotze rejected that similar fact evidence, and we had to come to this court to overturn that and get the similar fact evidence in. But once we could run it for all those 42 days of court with all the similar fact evidence, we felt that at least we would make some form of impact. The family couldn't accept it, but they went along with it because it was the general wisdom at that stage.
So there's a few themes I want to explore there with what you've just said. But my lord, I also see that we've reached 1 o'clock.
Oh, okay. I want to start on something new. All right. At this time, we're adjourned for lunch.
Thank you.
See you at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.
Can we go to adjourn?
All right.
No, yeah, just see which one.